let the dogs out? Who let the dogs out? Who let the dogs?
Hi everyone, welcome to our teaching and learning video.
For our project today, we are going to be dog trainers and teach our dogs how to go through an agility course.
So everyone come meet our dogs. This is Boomer.
And this
And
is Maddie.
Hey guys, so the first thing that we're going to talk about are some of the equipment and supplies that we use to create the course. So the first objects that we used were just 2 orange cones for a start line.
Okay, and then we used a pool floaty to have the dogs run around it. And this is a good example that you can use anything at the patient's house. And it's like inexpensive and convenient.
So for the next part of the course, we used 2 pool noodles, and we just laid them down on the ground as little jumps. And so for Maddie, we would lay them on the ground so she could just step over them. But for Boomer, sometimes we would hold them higher up so he would have more of a challenge and have to jump over it.
Next, we used 2 orange cones for the dogs to do a figure 8 around.
So for the last part of the course, we used really big skewer sticks and put them in the ground so that they could be weaving poles.
And then we placed 2 more orange cones at the end for the finish line.
Okay, so when you're training your dog to do an agility course, you want to have some sort of leading object to lead them through the course and motivate them to do it. So in Boomer's case, he's really motivated by the tennis ball, so I use that as his leading object and then would reward him with it when he would finish the course.
And Maddie loves her treats, so I use that as her leading object. And sometimes she would stop halfway through the course, so I would have to reward her for the part that she did in order for her to be able to get through the whole thing.
Okay, so for our last piece of equipment, it's kind of optional. You can choose to use a dog leash or not. This can be for a safety reason. If your dog isn't able to be off the leash without running away, you would definitely want to make sure you have them on one. But in our case, Hannah was just more successful having Maddie on a leash to help her lead her through it. Whereas Boomer was much better at performing the course when he was off the leash and able to kind of have more room and more free range to perform the course.
And here's a picture of us and our dogs and our supplies. And you can really make this as complex as you want by adding more supplies and equipment, or as simple as you want by adding just a few household things.
Okay, so some of the ways that we can grade down the objects and properties are first by having larger handles on the leash. Boomer has this one leash that has a big grip, which is much easier to hold, and I think that would make leading him through the course easier. Second, we could use a larger leading object. So for example, me using a tennis ball as a leading object was probably much easier than Hannah using a small treat if they're having trouble with gripping. And then lastly, just having less obstacles in the course could be a way to grade down. It would just require less setup and less cleanup and just be overall more simple in having to sequence and sustain your attention and endurance throughout the course.
So a few ways to grade up the objects and properties. You could have smaller treats or balls or like a leading object. So using a treat that's smaller than a ball would help with grip strength and gripping small objects. You could also put the obstacles closer together, such as the weaving poles. And this makes you do it faster and then having more objects in the course. And this would require more setup, more sequencing, and more cleanup.
Okay, so here we have our activity analysis algorithm, and this just kind of highlights the steps that we took for taking our dogs through an agility course. So the first thing that we did was determine what equipments and supplies we needed for the course, and then we gathered those supplies accordingly. Second, we set up the course. So we had to make decisions on how we wanted the course to flow and in what order we wanted to go to, how long and spread out we wanted it to be. Third, we each chose an object to lead our dog with. So I chose a tennis ball to lead Boomer with, and Hannah chose a treat to lead Maddie with. Next, we familiarized our dogs with the course. We just kind of had them have fun with it at first and just do a couple run-throughs. And then fifth, we prepared our dog at the start of the course. And then we led our dog through each obstacle throughout the course. And then lastly, when they finished, we would reward the dog. And then cleaned up the equipment and supplies once we were completely done with it.
All right, so some of the learning methods that we used were we watched a lot of YouTube videos and we saw a lot of different routines and we're able to kind of form our routine from that. We also researched websites, and then a lot of our learning came from trial and error and finding out what works and what doesn't for our dogs. I did a lot of part task training with Maddie, and I found this easier to do with her because when we tried to do the whole thing, she would get really unmotivated, and it made it really difficult for me to guide her through the whole task.
So I found that I had more success with Boomer in doing whole task training. Boomer is a very high energy, fast-paced dog. So I was able to lead him easier when we would just do the whole thing start to finish rather than breaking it up part by part.
So one of the feedback methods that we used was extrinsic feedback, and an example of this was whenever Maddie was having trouble going through the whole course, so Alyssa suggested to me to do part task training and give her treats more frequently.
So another type of feedback that we used was intrinsic feedback. To lead our dogs through this course, we really had to pay attention to our balance and our pacing and our coordination between ourselves and our dogs and the objects in the obstacle course.
So another feedback method that we used was bandwidth feedback, and this is when you give feedback to the other person when you know they're making an error or you see an area for improvement. So an example of this is when Alyssa was trying to keep up with Boomer and she was running really fast and she wasn't even watching where she was going. She was all over the place. So I told her to be more careful and watch where she was going. So a few ways to grade down the motor skills. For pacing, you can perform the routine with a dog at a slower pace. So an example of this is that I worked with an older dog, so I walked the routine instead of running it. You can also grade down the reaching, so you can perform the routine without reaching the arm out as much as possible and keeping it closer to the body. And then another way you can grade down is enduring, and you perform the routine with part task training, so you don't do the whole thing at once to allow time for you to rest.
So some of the ways that we can grade up the motor skills are first by grading up paces. So we can do this by performing the routine with our dog at a faster pace. So like I said earlier, I worked with a much younger, more energetic dog. So he was really high energy and actually did much better when we would run at a faster pace rather than trying to have him slowly do it. Another way you can grade up is by grading up endures. So this would be by performing the routine with whole task training, so going from start to finish rather than doing part task training. And then lastly, we can grade up by grading up coordinates. So we can actually do the routine with the dog rather than just running or walking alongside. So I did this by actually jumping over some of the things with Boomer and actually doing the figure 8 with him and things like that.
So a few ways to grade down the process skills. For gathering, you can have the tools already gathered for the patient before the activity. And then sequencing, you can perform the routine with less steps involved, such as only having them do half the course.
So some of the ways that we can grade up process skills, we could grade up gathers by having the patient gather the materials needed for the activity, or in this case for the obstacle course, by gathering them individually. We can grade up choosing by having the patient choose which tools are necessary to complete the activity and have them choose the materials that they want to use for the obstacle course. We can grade up sequencing by having the patient come up with their own sequence for the routine. And then lastly, we can grade up search and locate by having the patient look for and find the materials that are needed for the activity on their own, maybe around their house, looking for household items and things like that.
So a few ways to grade down the social interaction skills. Firstly, you can have the patient perform this individually and then work their way to working on it with other people. You can also grade down the approach or start. And so you could have this graded down if the interaction with another person was already set up, so they didn't have to go up and initiate talking to a person about it and asking them to do the activity with them.
So some of the ways that we can grade up the social interaction skills for this activity are by having the patient perform this with a group so that they have to communicate and work with others in order to get the task done. Another way we could grade this up is by having them take turns. So if we have a group of people and they all have to take turns to take their dogs throughout the course. And then lastly, we can grade up by having them work on time's duration. So this means we could have someone describe the activity to another person in an appropriate amount of time. So not having them take up too much time to describe the activity or too little of time to describe the activity.
We could grade this activity space demands down by creating a simpler, shorter course that could accommodate small backyards and even indoor courses. We could also use smaller objects to make up the course, and this would require less space. We could also perform this activity with no other objects or distractions in the way.
So some of the ways that we can grade the space demands up is by having them create a larger, more difficult course that requires more space. We could also grade it up by setting up the course in an unfamiliar place so the patient may not be quite as comfortable with the area and may have to work on their adaptation skills a little bit. And then lastly, we could grade this up by creating the course in an environment where the patient may be presented with some sort of distractions.
So I'm going to talk about a few ways to grade down sequencing and timing. One way to do this is the patient does the sequence with less steps. Another way would be the obstacles could be in a straight line instead of scattered, so they know exactly which step to do next. And then also the patient could do half the sequence at a time, so it's not as many steps that they have to remember at a certain time.
Some of the ways that we can grade up the sequencing and timing are we can have the patient come up with their own sequence. We could have the obstacles be scattered and the patient has to remember which one comes next, so they have to really focus on the sequence of the routine and what the ordering is. And then lastly, we could grade up by having the patient perform the activity as fast as they can, so just working on beating their own personal record. So they have a little bit of sense of urgency and have to focus more on their timing and having to sequence everything right.
Okay, so a few ways to grade down the required actions. You can walk the course with the dog, hold the leading object lower down, and then you could have someone help you set up and clean up.
So some of the ways that we could grade up the required actions are by running the course with the dog. We could also hold the leading object higher up, which would require more arm strength. And then we could have the patient set up and clean up the course individually. So our rationale for using this activity to restore or maintain performance skills is that it requires quite a bit of client factors. It requires attention, memory, sequencing complex movement, orientation, sensory functions such as visual, vestibular, proprioceptive, and touch. And then it also requires muscle functions and movements. So we think that this could be a really fun and enjoyable intervention technique for someone who loves their dog and loves spending time with their dog and who needs to work on these particular client factors. Another part of our rationale for using this activity as an intervention strategy is that it's just super easy and convenient and cheap for a patient to perform at their home. Or I live in an apartment complex and we did it just right outside in the yard, and it didn't require any money. We just took household items, so it was just easy, it was fun. It was tiring, so you can definitely grade up or grade down. And we think that this could be beneficial to a wide variety of populations as well. So as for learning preferences, I definitely am a visual learner, so watching the YouTube videos beforehand and reading information on websites was the most helpful for me to learn how to go about performing this activity. And I also think that this activity was really meaningful for me because being Boomer's mom is one of my most meaningful occupations. So being able to do an activity with him that benefited both him and I was really special for me, and I definitely will be doing this again just for fun in the future.
So I'm also a visual learner, and so it was really helpful for me to watch the videos and get an idea of routines that people do. However, I learned the most when I was actually out there doing it. I was able to make modifications and adjustments as I went through the routine, and it really helped me learn how to do it. And then the meaning and purpose for me was that I love spending time with Maddie, and it was a great activity to work on so many skills at once, both for me and her.
So I think this experience will help me to teach this particular activity as well as other occupations to clients because it's something that we had never done before. I had never really looked into, read about, or seen done before. So I really had to learn everything from scratch. So I think dog agility training may not necessarily be a common occupation that we will have to teach patients. However, many of our patients will have dogs, so I think this could be an at-home intervention that we could present to them. That could be a relatively inexpensive and easy task for them to perform and put together. And for people who love being around their dogs, this could just be something that is really enjoyable for both themselves and their pets as well.
I think that this experience will help us teach other occupations to clients because we were able to take something we didn't know and learn it and then turn around and teach it to other people. So if we get a client that wants to be able to do something that we don't know how to do, it's so important that we learn how to do it so we know what skills are needed to do the activity, how to modify it, grade it up or down, and then how to get them back to doing it.